My heart rate is climbing. Not fast, not scary fast, just wrong fast. Like my body's running, but I'm just standing here in a hospital gallery watching a monitor beep at a rhythm that doesn't match how calm I feel. Someone just pushed a clear liquid into my IV line. And here's the strange part. I can still hear the surgeon talking. I can still feel my own hand resting on the table, but I am not in my hand anymore. I'm about 4 feet above it, watching myself get watched. Yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I ended up floating above an operating table instead of, inside my own skull where I belong. Oh, hey there. Sorry, let me back up. I've been dead for a while now. Long enough that a while stopped meaning anything specific. Long enough that I've watched more human nervous systems short-circuit, misfire, panic, heal, and surprise themselves than any neurologist who ever lived. I don't have a medical degree. I never did. What I have is an eternity of front-row seats to the human operating system and an unhealthy amount of time to think about the night a stranger in scrubs handed me a drug that used to be for horses. So let's talk about ketamine. What it actually does to a human brain, not the club rumors, not the "it's basically horse tranquilizer" one-liner that every group chat repeats like it's a punchline, the actual biology. Because the real story is stranger and honestly more respectful of your brain than anything you've heard. Here's the first thing almost nobody gets right. Most anesthetics work by turning your brain's activity down. Ketamine does something almost the opposite. In certain brain regions, it turns activity up. This is known, not hypothesized. It's one of the best documented paradoxes in anesthesiology. Ketamine is what's called a dissociative anesthetic, a term coined in the 1960s by the researchers who first tested it, Edward Domino and Gunter Korson. And dissociative isn't a marketing word. It's a precise description of what the drug does. It disconnects or dissociates different regions of your brain from each other while leaving parts of them still switched on. Which brings us to something stranger. Patients under ketamine can have their eyes open. They can move. Their breathing often stays steady. Their airway reflexes often stay intact, which is a genuinely big deal because most anesthetics suppress the reflex that keeps you from choking on your own spit. That's exactly why ketamine became a battlefield anesthetic during the Vietnam War. Medics could use it in field conditions without a ventilator standing by, on patients who might need to be moved on a stretcher minutes later. Your brain isn't asleep on ketamine. It's more like unplugged from itself. Your brain is a switchboard operator, and ketamine started disconnecting calls between departments while leaving the lights on in every room. Here's the part nobody tells you. Ketamine's main target is a receptor called NMDA, and NMDA is one of the most important locks in your entire nervous system. NMDA receptors respond to glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter, the go signal that lets neurons talk to each other and critically lets them learn. NMDA receptors are central to something called long-term potentiation, which is the cellular basis of memory formation. Every time you learn a new face, a new song, a new route home, NMDA receptors are involved in wiring that memory into place. Ketamine blocks that lock. It sits inside the NMDA receptor's channel and jams it, a mechanism called channel block, which is why one of ketamine's signature effects is disrupted short-term memory formation during the experience itself. People often can't form a clean, continuous memory of what happened while the drug was active, not because the brain was unconscious, because the exact mechanism that would normally write the memory got physically blocked. Evolution built glutamate signaling to be one of the most protected, most heavily wired systems in the brain because learning is survival, which makes it almost funny. Evolution spent millions of years building an unbelievably precise memory writing machine, and one compound, discovered accidentally while chemists were trying to build a safer cousin of PCP in 1962, can jam the whole mechanism in about 30 seconds. Ketamine was originally synthesized as CI-581, designed specifically to be a safer alternative to PCP, which was already known in the early 1960s to cause severe, prolonged psychiatric side effects. Ketamine kept PCP's dissociative anesthetic properties with a shorter half-life and less severe emergence reactions. It was approved by the FDA in 1970. So, in a very real sense, ketamine's entire existence is a harm reduction project that worked. Let's talk about the K-hole, not as slang, as neuroscience. At higher doses, reports tell a total collapse of the normal sense of self and environment. No body, no time, sometimes no language, just pure, undifferentiated experience. This is where things shift from known to likely and hypothesized. So let's be honest about the uncertainty.
What's known, ketamine disrupts communication specifically between the thalamus and the cortex, a pathway researchers sometimes call the thalamocortical loop. The thalamus acts like a relay station, filtering and forwarding sensory information, sound, touch, vision, your body's position in space, up to the cortex, where it gets assembled into your moment-to-moment experience of being a person in a place. Ketamine appears to disrupt this relay. What's likely, when that filtering breaks down, the cortex starts working with fragmented, unfiltered, or self-generated input instead of a clean sensory feed, which may explain the vivid, sometimes dreamlike hallucinations reported at higher doses. What's still genuinely debated is exactly how this translates into the specific subjective experience of ego dissolution, the sense of I disappearing entirely. Researchers have hypotheses involving disrupted activity in the default mode network, the brain system associated with self-referential thought, but this remains an active area of study rather than settled fact. Your brain in this moment isn't broken. It's more like a GPS that lost satellite signal. It doesn't stop computing, it just stops knowing where it is. Here's where biology cheats a little. Why would a brain even be capable of this kind of disconnection? What evolutionary purpose does a self-dissolving nervous system serve? The honest answer? Probably none directly. The NMDA receptor system wasn't built by evolution to be blockable by a compound humans would synthesize in a lab 4 billion years after glutamate signaling first evolved. This is what researchers call an evolutionary side effect, not an evolutionary feature. Your brain's learning machinery is exquisitely tuned for one job, encoding experience, and ketamine's dissociative effects are essentially a bug report on a system that was never stress-tested against synthetic NMDA antagonists. Evolution built you an incredibly capable machine and never once considered that someone, one day, might jam a wrench into a very specific gear on purpose. Now here's the twist that turned ketamine from an anesthesia footnote into one of the most talked about developments in psychiatry in the last 20 years. In the early 2000s, researchers at Yale gave low, sub-anesthetic doses of ketamine to people with severe, treatment-resistant depression, people for whom standard antidepressants, which usually take 4 to 6 weeks to work, had failed entirely. The results were startling, measurable reductions in depressive symptoms within hours, sometimes within a single day. This is known, and it's now backed by a substantial body of clinical trials. What's likely, the leading mechanistic explanation, involves that same NMDA blockade triggering a cascade that activates a pathway called mTOR, which promotes rapid growth of new synaptic connections, particularly in the prefrontal cortex. Chronic stress and depression are associated with a measurable loss of these dendritic connections. Ketamine appears to rapidly reverse that loss, a process researchers sometimes describe, a little poetically, as regrowing the branches of stress-damaged neurons. In 2019, the FDA approved Esketamine, a nasal spray of 1 molecular half of the ketamine compound, specifically for treatment-resistant depression, administered under medical supervision. It's the first fundamentally new mechanism for treating depression approved in decades. Your pancreas doesn't get days off, but apparently your NMDA receptors get to switch careers into psychiatry. Let's ground this in real numbers, because naked statistics are useless without context. Standard antidepressants like SSRIs help meaningfully, but roughly a third of people with major depression don't achieve remission even after trying several different medications, a phenomenon called treatment-resistant depression. In controlled trials, ketamine and esketamine have produced rapid symptom relief in a meaningful subset of these patients within 24 hours, a timeline that, for context, is roughly the difference between waiting for a letter in the mail versus getting a text message. That speed is clinically enormous, particularly for patients experiencing acute suicidal ideation, where traditional antidepressants simply can't act fast enough to matter. To be clear about what's not settled, the durability of these effects without repeated dosing, the ideal treatment schedule, and the long-term outcomes of repeated ketamine therapy are all still active areas of research. This is a genuinely promising tool, not a cure-all, and it's administered in controlled clinical settings for a reason. Myth: ketamine is just a horse tranquilizer. Reality: ketamine was developed and approved for human use in 1970, years before its veterinary applications became widely known. It remains on the World Health Organization's list of essential medicines, the WHO's list of the safest, most effective medicines needed in any functioning health system, largely because of its usual safety profile in anesthesia, particularly its relatively low risk of suppressing breathing compared to many alternatives. Why it's false? Ketamine is used in veterinary medicine, yes, but calling it horse tranquilizer is like calling ibuprofen dog medicine because vets also prescribe it. The phrase survives because it sounds dismissive and vaguely dangerous, not because it's accurate. Myth: because it doesn't suppress breathing much, ketamine is basically safe to combine with anything. Reality: this is false, and it's a dangerous myth. Ketamine's relatively preserved respiratory drive applies mainly when it's used alone in controlled clinical doses. Combined with alcohol or other central nervous system depressants, that protective margin shrinks significantly. The combination can suppress breathing and airway reflexes far more than either substance alone.
Why it's false: your liver has the patience of a kindergarten teacher, but even kindergarten teachers have a breaking point. Metabolizing multiple depressants simultaneously through the same liver enzyme pathways creates unpredictable additive effects that ketamine alone is relatively safe data simply doesn't cover. Myth: the dissociation means you're unconscious, so you can't be harmed by what's happening around you. Reality: dissociation is not the same as unconsciousness. Emergence reactions, vivid, sometimes distressing hallucinations or disorientation as the drug wears off, are a documented phenomenon, first described in ketamine's earliest clinical trials in the 1960s. Being dissociated from your environment doesn't mean your environment stops being able to harm you. It means your ability to respond to danger is impaired. Why it's false: a brain that's disconnected from real-time sensory feedback is a brain that's more vulnerable to its surroundings, not less. It just doesn't feel that way from the inside, which is exactly the trap. Here's the trade-off your brain is quietly making every time NMDA receptors get blocked: memory encoding versus perceptual continuity. Your brain, under normal circumstances, is constantly trading processing resources between build a stable, continuous sense of self and place and encode this moment for later. Ketamine forces a hard trade-off. It sacrifices the encoding function almost entirely, which is why the experience often can't be clearly remembered afterwards, while other systems like basic motor function and breathing remain comparatively protected. The body is not trying to make this comfortable. The body is trying to protect the most survival-critical circuits: breathing, circulation, even while higher-order circuits like memory and self-location get thrown out of the lifeboat first. Not everyone's brain responds to ketamine the same way, and this is one of the genuinely underexplored parts of the science. Some individuals, at doses that produce mild dissociation in most people, experience minimal perceptual disruption. Others experience intense effects at comparably low doses. The leading explanations remain hypothesized rather than firmly established. Individual differences in NMDA receptor density, genetic variation in liver enzymes that metabolize ketamine, and baseline differences in thalamocortical connectivity have all been proposed. Nobody has a fully confirmed answer for why the same dose produces wildly different subjective experiences in different nervous systems. Your brain is not a universal machine running universal software. It's more like millions of slightly different toddlers, each one interpreting the same instructions in its own chaotic way. Which brings us to the part your body hopes never happens: what repeated, heavy, unsupervised use does over time. This is well documented, not speculative. Chronic heavy ketamine use is strongly associated with a condition called ketamine-induced cystitis, severe inflammation, and in advanced cases, physical shrinkage and scarring of the bladder.
Some long-term heavy users have required surgical bladder reconstruction. Researchers believe ketamine metabolites accumulate in urine and directly irritate the bladder lining, though the exact cellular mechanism is still being studied. There's also documented risk of cognitive effects with sustained heavy use, particularly deficits in working memory and executive function, and a real potential for psychological dependence, even though ketamine's physical withdrawal profile differs from substances like opioids or alcohol. Your bladder did not sign up for this. Nobody's bladder ever does. Let's walk through what typically happens minute by minute when ketamine is administered clinically. 0 to 1 minute IV administration, onset is nearly immediate. Dissociative effects can begin within seconds to a couple of minutes. 1 to 5 minutes, peak dissociative and analgesic effects. Heart rate and blood pressure often rise slightly, one of ketamine's quirks compared to most anesthetics, which tend to lower both. 5 to 15 minutes, typical effects begin to plateau and, depending on dose, start tapering. 30 to 60 minutes, for a typical clinical dose, dissociative effects substantially fade, though some grogginess, disorientation, or the emergence reactions we mentioned can linger. Following hours, full clearance from the bloodstream generally follows ketamine's relatively short half-life, though residual effects on coordination and judgment can outlast the peak experience, which is exactly why clinical ketamine administration always includes supervised recovery time. Compare that to alcohol's much slower, messier metabolic timeline, and you start to understand why ketamine's pharmacokinetics made it useful in emergency medicine in the first place. Fast on, fast off, predictable. Here's the part that matters most, and I say this as someone who watched thousands of people misjudge exactly this moment while I was alive, and millions more since. Respiratory depression from ketamine alone is uncommon at typical doses, but combined with alcohol, opioids, benzodiazepines, or other depressants, or in someone with an underlying medical vulnerability, the story changes fast, and the danger compounds.
Overdose signs to recognize in yourself or someone else: extremely slowed or irregular breathing, unresponsiveness to voice or touch, blue-tinted lips or fingertips, or a person who cannot be woken up. If you see this, call emergency services immediately. Keep the person on their side to protect their airway and stay with them until help arrives. This is not a moment for waiting it out. If I could go back, and believe me, I've had a truly excessive amount of time to think about what I'd say, here's what I'd tell myself. I'd tell myself that dissociation feels like safety because it removes fear, not because it removes danger. Those are not the same thing, and confusing them is one of the oldest mistakes in the human playbook. I'd tell myself that it's medically used, so it must be harmless, and it's dangerous when misused are both true at the same time, and holding both of those thoughts at once is what actually being informed looks like. I'd tell myself that my liver, my bladder, and my NMDA receptors were all doing their absolute best with what I gave them, and that respecting a body doesn't mean being scared of it. It means understanding what it's actually built to handle. And I tell myself that the version of me lying on that gurney, floating 4 feet above his own hand, thought he understood exactly what was happening to him. He had no idea. Neither did I until I had all of eternity to actually learn it. Your brain is not fragile. It is not simple. It is an absurdly capable, endlessly adaptive machine that evolution spent hundreds of millions of years refining, and it deserves to be understood, not feared, and definitely not gambled with carelessly. I've lived inside a body once. You're living inside yours right now. Try to actually get to know it before it's the only thing left watching from 4 feet up. If you want more videos like this, subscribe.